The prisoner release puts more doubt on the prospects of a long-term security agreement between Afghanistan and the United States. And without it, the U.S. and its European allies are likely to cut off billions of dollars in promised aid, which Afghans depend on. CCTV's Callebs is here now with more on the country's future.
And we're talking about a war that's been going on 13 years. And at its peak, there were more than 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Today, there are about 38,000. How many will be left at the end of 2014? That is a difficult question to answer. It all depends on the U.S. government and Afghan leaders working out a long-term security agreement. Hanging in the balance, economic, political, and human rights advances that have been eked out over the past 13 years.
2014 has been highlighted for years on Afghan calendars. It's long been spelled out that U.S.-led NATO troops are slated to pull out of the country this year, leaving Afghanistan on its own. Afghans are and have been depending on the U.S. for nearly everything, from security to propping up its fragile economy. There is widespread concern about the future.
We don't know whether the Americans will stay or leave. The Afghan economy is dependent on America, and Afghanistan is not at a stage where it can satisfy the needs of its people. We need foreign support.
The U.S. wants to keep some troops in Afghanistan after 2014 under what is called the Bilateral Security Agreement, or BSA, in part to make sure improvements in human rights, such as education for women, continue. The forces would help train the Afghan army as well as pursue al-Qaeda. However, right now, that's uncertain. Afghan President Hamid Karzai is so far refusing to sign the security agreement. Influential U.S. Senator John McCain met with Karzai in Afghanistan last week.
I am convinced that as a result of our long meeting with President Karzai, we have narrowed those differences, and I believe that we can look forward to the signing of the BSA and an implementation of it sooner rather than later.
Karzai has been a firm negotiator with the U.S., constantly updating his list of demands. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution and an expert on U.S.-Afghan foreign policy. O'Hanlon believes Karzai will sign the deal eventually.
He sort of figured us out that we will put pressure on him because we think he should negotiate and sign this thing quickly. But if he doesn't sign it quickly, we'll still wait because we recognize there's no better option.
O'Hanlon says he's hopeful Afghanistan will become more stable, pointing out Afghan police and troops are holding ground that U.S.-led troops have secured in more than a dozen years of fighting. But he says Karzai could be overplaying his hand.
There are a lot of miscalculations along the way, not least that he's squandering a lot of American goodwill, and he needs that goodwill to sustain the aid, sustain the American political consensus.
The unknowns are seemingly unlimited in Afghanistan, but U.S. patience with Karzai, it does have its limits. The longest war in U.S. history is wildly unpopular at home, but the last thing anyone wants is to surrender hard-fought gains and watch Afghanistan once again spiral out of control. And perhaps the worst-case scenario would be a full civil war and once again Afghanistan becoming a breeding ground for terrorist.
You know, what's interesting is the former governor of Montana was on one of the public affairs shows this weekend, and he said, you know, look at Iraq. You know, there weren't al-Qaeda there, and now they're there. And he was talking about how frustrated Americans are with Afghanistan. Let's just get out of there. But yet, that is one of the concerns, isn't it? That, I mean, al-Qaeda was there in Afghanistan. Clearly, it could be a breeding ground. There's a lot of uncertainty moving forward, right?
There's a lot of uncertainty. And you talk about Iraq, and remember, there are no U.S. troops in Iraq. The U.S. wanted to keep troops there. Iraq wanted nothing to do with them, and that was a very unpleasant split. In talking with O'Hanlon, I think it's interesting to talk with him because he's a contrarian. A lot of people have a very bleak outlook for Afghanistan in the immediate future. O'Hanlon, he doesn't want to use the word optimistic. He uses the word hopeful. He's hopeful it can move in a positive direction. He thinks Karzai will sign this, but Karzai is a politician. He's a survivor, and that's tough to do in Afghanistan. And when he leaves, he wants to be able to say, I squeezed everything I could squeeze out of all these countries, especially the U.S., to make sure they stay here and for Afghanistan's benefit.
You spent time in Afghanistan. What do you think about its future?
That's difficult to say. I mean, I haven't been there in a year, but I'm not as hopeful as Michael O'Hanlon. I'm certainly not as knowledgeable as Michael O'Hanlon as well. But I think you can make the argument that that country is so fractured. It's controlled by tribal leaders as much as anything, split dramatically by conservatives, split by language. I think the Taliban is going to be a very formidable part of the future of Afghanistan. It's going to have to be included in the political process. There are warlords that have been running that country for such a long time. Kabul is kind of like its own little island, if you will. That's pretty well controlled, but the outskirts, still the Wild West.
It's a difficult proposition, and no one's written the last chapter of this one. We're going to have to wait and see what happens, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Sean, thanks so much.